Welcome to the Week 3 Forum. Last week we learned about some of the constitutional principles that structure American government. This week we have an entire chapter devoted to the idea of federalism, which I mentioned in the overview is a system of sort of negotiated sovereignty. In a federal system of government, the national or federal government enjoys exclusive control over some features of government, which we call enumerated powers, basically the power of national defense, control of interstate commerce, things like that. And then there are areas in which the states enjoy, a great deal of control, which we describe as reserve powers. And then there are areas over which the federal and state governments share power, which are concurrent powers. Other countries that have federal systems of government include Canada, Germany, India, and Australia, among others. One question that comes to mind: why did the framers adopt such a complex system of government? Part of the answer is that necessity is the mother of invention. In the framers' experience, there were only two broad options: a monarchy, which they had rejected with the Revolutionary War, and a confederation, which they had originally adopted under the Articles of Confederation, and which proved to be unworkable at the time. Consequently, they created a hybrid system of government, which kind of took what they already had and added a more energetic, central government over the top of them. Again, I mentioned earlier, in the overview, that most citizens thought of themselves as New Yorkers, Virginians, and South Carolinians. In other words, the idea of Americans didn't exist at that point, and the framers understood that. Federalism as a principle of government metaphorically serves as both a sword and a shield in conflicts over public policy. As a principle, federalism helps to shape the battlefield, in other words. Everyone espouses states' rights when they don't want the federal government to take some action. The cake metaphor, that you have these two layers, and that the idea of sovereignty is really separate, is often useful for understanding how the practice of federalism certainly began, and that was basically the way it worked until well into the 19th century. And really up until the Great Depression, the general approach to federal-state relations reflected the layer cake view of federalism. The federal government effectively had no constitutional authority to intrude into issues that fell within the state's reserved powers. Students tend to assume that the federal government was always powerful, but for a good chunk of American history, most of the governing took place at the state level. The Supreme Court plays an influential role in determining the shape and scope of the relationship between the federal government and the states. In the early part of the 19th century, for example, the Supreme Court interpreted federalism very narrowly and literally, holding in Barron versus Baltimore, a decision handed down in 1833, that the Bill of Rights applied solely to the federal government and not to the states at all. In the late 19th century, the Supreme Court began to recognize that economic changes of industrialization required greater grants of regulatory authority to the federal government. However, those grants of regulatory authority remained insufficient to enable the federal government to engage in the kinds of regulatory policies necessary to ensure a smoothly functioning economy that respected the rights of both workers and consumers. The Great Depression changed all that. Franklin Roosevelt campaigned in 1932 in the midst of the Great Depression on the platform of a New Deal. And over the course of the 1930s, more and more power accrued to the federal government to combat the effects of the Great Depression. So instead of a layer cake like this, you begin to get a marble cake where the federal government is increasingly using expanded taxation powers and expanded regulatory authority to override the preferences of elected officials of state governments. Cooperative federalism, as it evolved during the New Deal and into the 1950s, significantly complicated the relationship between the federal and the state governments. So instead of a layer cake, you have a much more complex relationship where the federal government increasingly uses federal tax dollars in the form of grants to build, first of all, a healthcare infrastructure. Hospitals didn't just build themselves. The federal government made that money available. Roads were increasingly built because the federal government was granting the states that money. So when you think about the major accomplishments of the 20th century, one that's easy to forget is the highway system, which the states largely constructed using federal grant money. The federal highway system was begun in the 1950s under a Republican president, Eisenhower, who justified the cost on national security grounds. So during the 1950s and 60s, two important issues strained the relationship between federal and state governments. First, you saw the rise of the civil rights movement, along with feminism, which represented a challenge to the way Americans treated African Americans, other minorities, and women. Second, after a century of industrialization, pollution had reached really toxic levels, and both required, again, significant interventions on the part of the federal government. And landmark legislation passed in the 1960s dramatically expanded the regulatory authority of the federal government. This is a period we describe as New Federalism. One important feature of New Federalism was a determination in many instances to bypass state governments in order to provide directly to municipal governments in an effort to help African Americans and other minorities without having to persuade what were often recalcitrant state governments to participate in civil rights programs. And then again, we'll be discussing civil rights in greater length in a couple of weeks. And then you also get many direct impositions on the states and on the local governments. A raft of regulatory legislation, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, begins this process of basically saying, thou shalt not, continue polluting or doing these sorts of things, or you will produce an action plan to mitigate the pollution that is already existing. So the expansive regulatory power of the federal government produced a great deal of state opposition. And beginning with the Reagan administration, Republicans began advancing a very explicitly states' rights-oriented interpretation of federalism, arguing that more and more responsibility needed to be returned to the states. In fact, both parties tend to be strategic in their interpretation of federalism. They are centralizers when their party controls the federal government, and they are states' rights defenders when the other party controls the federal government. The question I want to ask the class, which issues should be left up to the states, and which issues need to be centralized and managed by the federal government? This is an important consideration. And another issue here is the idea of state capacity. Do most states have the ability to fund environmental regulatory policy? How vulnerable are states, some states especially, to regulatory capture, where powerful economic interests basically co-opt the state government? We have to recognize the dual nature of the laboratories of democracy aspect of federalism. Yes, states can be innovative in the service of democracy. They can also be innovative in the service of oppression. So what do you think about that? So as you think about Chapter 3, think about the complexity of operating a system of government where rules governing the interactions between the federal and state governments are subject to change. And then ask yourself, who should be in charge in a democratic government? Should the states do most of the work, knowing that the states have vastly different levels of wealth and resources? Or should the federal government do most of the work, knowing full well that that direction can lie, can head in an authoritarian pathway? As with last week, as you read and study the material, about federalism, consider certain questions. What's the most interesting aspect of this chapter for you? What, in your opinion, is the most important takeaway? What aspect of the material did you find most difficult to understand? Those are the issues that I want to talk about in the forum, particularly the material you are struggling to understand. I know this is a difficult chapter. Experience tells me that. But if you don't tell me what you're having trouble understanding, then I'm likely to assume you get it, right? So if you have questions, I'll help you. All right, let's have a great discussion this week.